Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Audrey Stewart, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore and Mount Auburn Hospital, I am so pleased to welcome you to today's Thursday morning talk with Tomiko Brown-Nagin presenting her new book, Civil Rights Queen Constance Baker Motley in the Struggle for Equality. She will be joined in conversation today by Maria Goldberg. In just a moment, I'll turn things over to Myra von Turkovich, the president of Thursday Morning Talks, but just a couple notes of housekeeping first. This morning's discussion will conclude with some time for questions. If you have a question at any time during the talk, go to the Q&A button on your screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. We also have closed captions available. Feel free to enable that by clicking the CC button on your screen. In just a moment, I'll post links in the chat to purchase Civil Rights Queen from Harvard Bookstore. Now more than ever, your purchases support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you again for tuning in. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. There will also be a link for donation for Mount Auburn Hospital. Please support them. They're doing everything they can to protect our community during this difficult time. You can donate through the link or send a check to the address in the chat. You can also email Myra with any questions surrounding donation or anything regarding Thursday morning talks. And finally, as you have no doubt experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as we can. Thank you in advance for your patience and your understanding. Now, I'm so pleased to turn things over to Myra von Turkovich. Myra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Audrey. Good morning, all, and welcome to the 5th week of the Thursday morning talks of 2022. For those of you joining us for the first time, our volunteer group of 30 has for 85 years hosted these talks and donated the proceeds from our subscribers to the Mount Auburn Hospital, our local hospital here in Cambridge. Today, we welcome subscribers from Boulder and Aspen, New York City, Memphis, Providence, Flat Rock, Hinsdale, Illinois, and New Canaan. If you're interested in supporting our cause, please refer to the chat for the link to the Thursday Morning Talks homepage. We welcome any and all donations. If by chance you have subscribed and missed any of the previous talks, please know that we will send the links for those talks as soon as the Harvard Bookstore provides us with those links. They actually just came in. You will get them shortly. Many thanks to Harvard Bookstore for donating their time and expertise and assisting us with bringing our talks via Zoom to all of you. And thank you to our speaker coordinator, Dale Manukin, joining us from California, who works tirelessly and continuously to bring us our exceptional speakers. Now to our program today. The interlocutor for our guest is Maria Goldberg, senior editor at Pantheon Books. Our speaker is Tomiko Brown-Nagin, Dean of Harvard's Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, the Daniel P.S. Paul Professor of Constitutional Law at Harvard Law School, and Professor of History at Harvard University's Faculty of Arts and Sciences. In 2019, she was appointed chair of the Presidential Committee on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, of the American Philosophical Society, and of the American Law Institute, and a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. Her previous book, Courage to Dissent, won the Bancroft Prize in 2011. Tomiko frequently appears as a commentator in the media. She lives in Boston with her family. Welcome, Maria. Welcome, Tomiko. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Myra, for that introduction, and thanks to Thursday Morning Talks for having me, as well as the Harvard Bookstore for hosting the program. And I'm just delighted to be in conversation with Maria Goldberg, my editor from Pantheon Books. We're going to start the program with a brief reading from a chapter of my book on Constance Baker Motley's most famous case, the battle to desegregate Ole Miss. This man has got to be crazy. Thurgood Marshall yelled to Constance Baker Motley in January of 1961. That's your case. Marshall had descended upon Motley's office waving a letter from James Meredith. The missive contained such a preposterous idea that Marshall thought the writer must be out of his mind. I am submitting an application for admission to the University of Mississippi, Meredith wrote, and I am anticipating encountering difficulty with the various agencies here in the state. In view of the brewing trouble, Meredith requested Marshall's legal assistance. After Marshall had finished laughing about Meredith's proposal to sue Ole Miss, he washed his hands of the case. Marshall knew that Motley had the smarts and the courtroom skills to do the job, and he thought her gender would be an advantage. The fight to desegregate Ole Miss might get someone killed, but in the context of Mississippi's white supremacist yet chivalrous culture, as Marshall saw it, a Black woman would fare better than a Black man. Any white supremacist, he opined, would scarcely think twice about murdering a Black man, but might hesitate to lynch a Black woman. The very idea of a Black woman lawyer violently clashed with the worldview of Dugas Shands, Esquire, the white male lawyer who defended Ole Miss. Shands refused to address the Inc. Fund lawyer in the customary manner as Mrs. Motley. Instead, he used only indirect references, calling Motley her or she. At one point early on, Motley jumped to her feet in a bid to put an end to the charade. But the tipping point occurred when Shands called her Constance. Motley immediately objected. I would like for Mr. Shands not to call me by my first name, Motley insisted. Henceforth, the lawyer referred to Motley as the New York counsel. After months of struggle and endless delays, James Meredith had had enough. Browbeaten by white resistance, Meredith wrote to Motley, resigned. I will not attempt to obtain an undergraduate degree from the University of Mississippi, the letter proclaimed. Keenly aware that Motley, who had poured herself into the case, would be disappointed in his decision, Meredith pleaded for understanding. I am human after all, he wrote. Meredith had grown tired of waiting for a deliverance that never came. Life had passed him by. His peers had graduated from college, begun careers, and moved on with their lives. In the meantime, he and his family had endured a high cost, literally and figuratively, fighting to integrate the University of Mississippi. Motley was stunned by the message. In order to salvage her case and support her client, Motley morphed from lawyer to therapist, a role she often played in high-stakes civil rights cases. To get a handle on the fraught situation, the pair would talk in Motley's New York City apartment, where Meredith could taste freedom. There, Motley cajoled Meredith. She persuaded him that he had gone too far and that too much had been invested in the case by the Inc. Fund and the Federal Court of Appeals to abandon the litigation. Just as Meredith reached his breaking point, support arrived, precisely as Motley had promised. On September 10th, 1962, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black intervened, halting any further action preventing James Meredith's matriculation to Ole Miss. While in Mississippi, Motley built community with a small band of lawyers and activists who took part in LDF's effort to end Jim Crow in the state. She leaned on Medgar Evers, the NAACP's most prominent operative in Mississippi, who often invited Motley to his home, where she enjoyed home-cooked meals and fellowship with Evers, his wife, and their children. But only 1 month after Motley left Mississippi for the last time, Medgar Evers was assassinated. It devastated her. Motley couldn't get out of bed for weeks following his death. She couldn't even bring herself to attend his funeral. Nevertheless, she had left the state victorious. Constance Baker Motley emerged as one of the most respected lawyers in America. A story in the New York Times titled "Integration's Advocate" captured the professional heights to which Motley had soared. A tall, striking woman with piercing dark eyes is almost always in the courtroom in the eye of the hurricane surrounding the struggle for civil rights in the South. Motley's fight to desegregate Ole Miss brought her public esteem and professional success, along with devastating loss and profound pain. Thank you.
Tomiko, I love that section of your book. It is one of my favorite chapters. It's such a pleasure to hear you read it. I just want to quickly say thank you to you for being in conversation with me. Thank you to our audience members and to the Harvard Bookstore. And I first just want to congratulate you on this. This is a towering achievement, and it is a work about a towering figure. And I hope everyone buys a copy of the book. From the link in the chat. But I want to start by talking about her, about Constance Baker Motley. And you've spent so much time in your scholarship writing about people who have been overlooked, perhaps in popular memory, and even in academia. And there have been so many, right? And I wanted to know why Motley? You know, what was it that drew you to her in particular?
Well, she's such an inspiring figure, Maria. And I encountered her initially as a scholar when I wrote my book, Courage to Dissent, Atlanta and the Long History of the Civil Rights Movement. Motley litigated the Atlanta school desegregation case all the way to the Supreme Court. And in the process of writing my book, I included a biographical sketch about Motley. And it was in that context that I came to appreciate that at that time, there was relatively little research and writing about her. And I thought that that was odd, given her towering achievements. And I wanted to correct that as a scholar. Now, I will say that at the same time, you know, the genre of biography requires something of one as an author that is monumental. You know, I wanted so much to get it just right about Motley and to, in the process, make it plain that she is a figure whom we ought to remember. She was, in fact, the counterpart to Thurgood Marshall, who is well known. She represented Martin Luther King Jr. She represented the movement in many cities, helped to work on Brown versus Board of Education, desegregated higher education in the South, in the Ole Miss case at the University of Alabama and the University of Georgia. And I think that it is important to look at the movement through the lens of gender and the eyes of this great woman.
Yeah, that leads me to another question that I had for you, which is that I feel that you made a very intentional decision in this book to in how you approached her and her story. You're not simply recounting, you know, the many remarkable achievements, right, that she made, but you're really positioning them within the context of the time, and you're bringing a very specific lens to all of them, and to kind of for your reader to understand, right, the decisions that she made and the choices that she made as she proceeded on her path. And I was wondering if you could speak to us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, the lens that I bring, the primary lens, relates to gender. It is a lens that I think is still so relevant to our age, to consider how a woman, a parent, balances a professional life and family, how gender shapes opportunities, how gender affects conceptions of leadership, and also what I call invoking James Baldwin, the price of the ticket for outsiders who become a part of the power structure. That was one of the most compelling themes that I wanted to pursue through the lens of Constance Baker Motley, who lived this tripartite life. So she was first a civil rights lawyer, had great impact there. Then she was a New York City politician, and then capped off her career on the federal bench as the first Black woman appointed to the bench. And through all of those phases, she took her commitment to social justice, and yet those professional roles are very different. And I wanted to explore how they looked different depending on what she was doing in the moment. And also just explore all of the historical figures that she interacted with, from Thurgood Marshall to Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Pauli Murray, Shirley Chisholm, and the list goes on. It's really a book that not only tells a story about an individual, but allows us to look onto, in a panoramic fashion, the civil rights and women's rights movement over time in this country.
Yeah, and I would love to come back to that, but I want to kind of step back and ask you about Constance Baker Motley's beginnings, because these achievements were not predetermined for her, right? So can you tell us a little bit about where she came from? Because that's such an important part of her story, I think, and it's part of what makes her person so inspiring.
Indeed. Thank you for that question. She grew up in the shadow of an Ivy League institution, Yale University in New Haven, where she was born in 1921. Her parents were immigrants to this country. They came from Nevis in the West Indies. And in many ways, her story is all about the immigrant experience in America, the first generation and then the second generation. Her parents were culturally conservative. They enjoyed being members of the British Empire. They were religious. They believed in the politics of respectability. Her father was very traditional in terms of the gender roles in the family, and they instilled in her a desire to be a striver. Now, at the same time, everyone thought that she was crazy when she developed this interest in becoming a lawyer. It was a curious aspiration for a working class Black girl growing up in New Haven, where all of her family members, her male family members, worked for Yale University in critically important service positions, but service positions nevertheless. So no one would have predicted, not even her family, that this young woman who did well in school, but nevertheless was in a working class family, no one would have predicted that she would have ended up where she did.
And I feel like you illustrated that so beautifully in precisely that section of the book that you read, because once she becomes a lawyer and she's traveling throughout the South, arguing these really major civil rights cases, she's a sensation in a number of ways. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think the times have changed so much in several decades, and I think maybe for some younger readers, it will be surprising just how rare her presence was.
Yes. So her first trial took place in Jackson, Mississippi. And when she went to Jackson, she said herself that it was like a circus was in town. She went there with Bob Carter, who was an African-American male lawyer from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and they would attract a crowd wherever they went. She in particular, because remember, few people had seen Black lawyers. Women lawyers were rare, and she was this incredible combination of a Black woman lawyer. And so people did not know what to make of her. They, scrutinized the way she was dressed. They were amazed at the way she spoke. And of course, what she was doing was truly transgressive, radical even, to stand up in a courtroom in a context of the most racially repressive state in the country, where the Black male lawyer who was local counsel, and there was only one or two in Mississippi who worked with the Inc. Fund, would literally bend over at the waist to perform his subservience in the courtroom, because that was what was required, given the racial repression in Mississippi. And although he was their local counsel, he would actually sit apart from the NAACP lawyers at the counsel table. And I read about how as late as 19 62, when she's litigating the Meredith case, the white lawyers are just disdainful of her. They just can't believe that they have to deal with her, essentially. And the thing about it, Maria, is that she was just, the right person to do this job. And a part of it had to do with having been raised in New Haven to these West Indian parents, father in particular, who was imperious, who saw, the immigrant families as a cut above the African Americans, and who essentially inculcated in her a sense of superiority. And so when Motley goes to Mississippi and to other places, Alabama, South Carolina, other places, and she is confronted with these white lawyers who, leave her hand hanging out when she goes to shake their hands, she is just, she marvels at it. Like, me? I'm of the Bakers of New Haven. My family members work for Yale. They have read the prestige of Yale into themselves. And, she thinks, well, I'm a graduate of Columbia Law School. I don't know where you went to law school, right? And she considers herself certainly on the same level, if not superior. And there are just lots of stories that illustrate how she is just she's a shocking figure to many people whom she encounters in the South. And also, I want to say, Maria, she is an inspiring figure to the local African Americans and some white women who appreciate the power that she is bringing to the courtroom, her intellect, her elegance, and she just awes people.
Yeah, I think it's amazing that she's exactly as you said, this person who on the one hand inspires people to pour into the courtroom, and they love watching her do what she does, which is put these white male lawyers down, right, and demand respect from them. And on the other hand, she's there, and as that selection that you read illustrated, I mean, she's putting her life on the line every time she does this, right? People, Medgar Evers, and people would get assassinated regularly, right?
Absolutely. Her life was under threat. And that is one of the things that I do labor to bring out in the book, that she was so courageous. And to have courage does not mean, Maria, that she was never scared. In fact, she was often scared. She had a lot of anxiety about her surroundings. And she writes about this in her own memoir. Just to go back to the Medgar Evers situation, when Medgar Evers would drive her back and forth to the courtroom, federal courthouse in Mississippi, and there are instances where the state police would tail Evers and Motley, and she could hardly breathe. Evers would say, "Don't look back, put your legal pad down, because they're on our tail." And, it was a harrowing moment many times. And she understood that she might not get back to New York to see her son, her young son, and her husband. And yet she pressed on because she felt that she was on a mission, no less than James Meredith thought that he was on a mission, or Martin Luther King Jr. thought that he was on a mission, not to mention all of the local people who supported this movement in the South and beyond.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's remarkable. I wanted to ask you also about her time in the NAACP LDF. So Thurgood Marshall was a mentor to her, but I want to talk to you about her, something that you describe as a big disappointment for her. When it came time for Thurgood Marshall to appoint his successor, things did not go the way that she wanted. And you bring this kind of very interesting, I think, analysis to that moment. And I wonder if you can't describe what happened to us and what you made of it.
Sure. Well, first, I want to emphasize that Thurgood Marshall did something transgressive in hiring her in 1945, first as a law student, and then in 1946, she became a full-time member of the staff, because he did so at a time when women just were not hired. Motley tried to get a job at a prestigious Manhattan law firm, and she was turned away, just the same as Ruth Bader Ginsburg was turned away later, or Sandra Day O'Connor. And he hired her on the spot and talked to her about women in his life, African-American school teachers who were strong and intelligent. And yet in 1961, when he was moving on from the Inc. Fund, and there was this moment when a decision had to be made about his successor, he passed her over. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I bring the lens of gender and center her experience. So the analysis you mentioned is that I don't try to make a determination about what Marshall should have done, but I do emphasize that she thought gender was a component of it. She also thought race was a component of it, and that's simply because Marshall himself was thinking about his career, and of course, many people would tar the civil rights lawyers with claims of racism merely because they wanted equality for Black people. And so there was a sense that it would be advantageous if he actually didn't select any of the Black lawyers who might have been in line for this position. But I focus on gender and do it to make a point about gender and leadership, how leadership itself is gendered. And so Motley, in fact, was not a typical, anyone's typical example or expectation about what a leader should be or what a leader should look like, because in fact, the leaders were male. And if you take Marshall as an example, he was gregarious. He was a storyteller. He lit up the room. And that's not unlike Martin Luther King Jr., limelight seeking, being entertaining and imposing for the sake of the movement. Motley was not like that. She didn't need to be or try to be the center of attention. She was reserved. She was elegant. She did the work. And although and she was physically striking. And I think all of those things were advantages to her when she was trying to work her way into the legal profession. But when it came time to make that decision about leadership, those things likely were not advantageous to her at all, because again, she didn't look like a leader, and leaders were men.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that time in her life and the question of radicalism with you, because in the early chapters of the book, when she's this, when she's this lawyer, she's this strategist for the civil rights movement, she is, her very presence is radical, and her beliefs in equality are radical. And once she enters politics, that starts to change a little bit. Or I think what happens, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the way that people view her has evolved. The times have evolved. And I think that's a theme that runs throughout the book, right? Is how we think of radicalism or progressivism changes, and how she, the work that she did on behalf of her views also evolved as her roles changed. And can you speak to that?
That's exactly right. Maria, I like to write works that are sweeping in terms of their temporal scope. And I did here. And the effect of that is that we can actually see the civil rights movement evolve. And by 1964, when Motley is entering politics, there are many people who consider the quest for integration, or the singular focus on integration, including around schools, is kind of passé, or it's beside the point. So this is an era of Black radicalism, Black power, Black Panthers eventually. And Motley her politics look so tame in comparison to those people. And I make the point that they were tamer, right? So she was entering Democratic Party politics. She was sponsored by white male and Black male politicians in the Democratic Party in New York. And politics requires, let's call it triangulation, and appeal to a variety of constituencies, whereas the proponents of Black power and others in the community were more focused by that time on expressing their own views about what equality meant, what freedom meant, and not that interested in the perspectives of the Democratic Party, the establishment. And so she was in a position of being seen as somewhat of a passe liberal by that component of the movement. But of course, she was elected. She was very popular, and the moment in politics paved the way for her career on the bench. She wasn't in politics very long because everyone could see that, wow, she's just a great asset, just a stunning figure, remarkable figure. And it paves the way for the third part of her career.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you to talk about this incredible moment. One of my other favorite parts of the book is when she debates Malcolm X on television. And I wanted to ask you to tell that story because I think it's so important to the book that you're writing, because even though you have such admiration and her figure is so inspiring and courageous and everything that you said, you are very careful to not write a hagiography about her, and you humanize her, and you give her, you make her seem on the page the complex person that she would have been in real life. And I was wondering if you could tell that story because it so perfectly illustrates that. And I think we sometimes, when we look back to some of these figures in our past, and we want them to be these kind of two-dimensional heroes for us, but being first is not always so simple, right?
That is exactly right. And I do include this chapter about where I feature the story about her debating Malcolm X and others. And one might consider it a failing, Maria, because she essentially was sidelined by Malcolm X, who famously used these debates to make pretty acerbic points. And he did that with Motley on the stage, where she responded to him in her lawyerly way, asking at many points leading questions, trying to get him to concede that things had changed for Black Americans over time, and essentially to concede that the work that she and others had done on the legal side of the civil rights movement was transformational, and he just wasn't having it. At a couple of points, he didn't even respond to what she said. Instead, he talked about the things that he wanted to talk about, which is a great debater. You deflect and you say what you want to say, right? He talked about how there were millions of African-American men locked up. And here you have this person talking about how things have changed for Black Americans. And of course, that wasn't the truth. And it was a bit of, humble pie, I would say, for her. She didn't characterize it that way. It's not something that she talked about in her own, in her autobiography. Of course, she wouldn't have. And I was happy to just have found that transcript and use that story to illustrate that she was human. She did have failings. Her sense of her own place in history, I think, contributed to that moment where she didn't look so good.
Right. And then I want to talk about her judgeship a little bit too. And I just want to remind everyone that if you have any questions, to please enter them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But I wanted to ask you about the legacy of her time on the bench, which you get into at the very end of the book, and which she took a lot of care for. She spent a lot of time, I think, leaving her legacy, right? So can you tell us a little bit about what that was?
Sure. Well, first I'll talk about how women's rights advocates and civil rights advocates reacted to her nomination, and that is that they were overjoyed. They thought that one of their own would go to the courthouse, and that in some sense she would be able to validate the claims of the civil rights movement. And in some cases that happened. So I discussed how she implemented the Civil Rights Act, opening the doors to the professional workplace for women lawyers and sports journalists and others. And she also issued a decision in a prisoner's rights litigation case that was path-breaking, awarding damages money to an imprisoned person who claimed that solitary confinement was a violation of the Constitution. She agreed, and there was great blowback. But the overarching point that I make, Maria, is that the idea that there's sort of a one-to-one correlation between identity and outcomes in court is just mistaken for so many reasons. First of all, Motley was an individual. And so I start off talking about how she was culturally conservative, and she's from an immigrant household. And so that means it sort of destroys the idea that there would be a singular understanding of what a good outcome would be for women or for African Americans in anyone's courtroom. And then there were the constraints that were imposed by the law itself. Fundamentally, the law is status quo preserving. There's a built-in command of judges to follow prior law. And as a federal trial court judge, as opposed to an appellate judge, she was particularly bound by that, as well as professional norms. Like she wanted to be promoted just as anyone would want to be promoted. And that meant that she really had to be careful to illustrate all of the classic judicial virtues. And she did that. She was careful. And the long and short of it is that I think that her appointment was so important symbolically. It affirmed the anti-discrimination principle that the movement had fought for so long. And yet I pull back at the end and sort of question again this notion that these symbols of change are going to be able to implement change, execute change in the way that a lot of people think when these icons of equality are in positions, whether it's on the court or in the White House or anywhere else. There's a great weight on her in this position. And I think that certainly in this moment, it's a timely lesson to draw.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you next, which is that, so we're in this moment, right, where Justice Breyer is retiring. President Biden has announced that he was going to appoint a Black woman or nominate a Black woman to the role. That person will also be a first, right, in the way that Constance Baker Motley perhaps was in her time. And I wanted to go back to that point you made at the very beginning about one of the driving questions of your book is, what is the price of the ticket? James Baldwin question. What is the toll that being a first, takes on a person? And I wanted to ask you about what that looked like for Motley, and if you think there's anything that we should be, bearing in mind given the moment that we're living in and what we're about to see.
Sure. Well, I will quote for you what I include at the end of the book, the epilogue, and it's from a letter from Bella Abzug, this New York first woman congressperson in New York, who was Motley's law school classmate. And she wrote to her saying that being first is both an honor and a burden. And I would say that was true for Constance Baker Motley, who herself was on Supreme Court shortlists, but she never got the nod. And part of the reason that she never got the nod, Maria, was because her identity, I would say, was weaponized against her. So there were those who, even when she was nominated for the federal court, said that, although she did amazing things, she argued and won 9 of 10 cases at the Supreme Court. They said that her litigation record, because it was achieved in the context of civil rights, was too narrow, or that she couldn't be fair to litigants because she had litigated civil rights cases. There were colleagues who definitely did not want women on the bench. She was only the 5th woman federal judge, first Black woman. And I tell stories about how when she was first appointed to the bench, she had some disheartening encounters, including in the federal courthouse where her chambers were. There is a cafe in the courthouse, and when she first entered it, one of her colleagues made it clear that he didn't want her there. And so thereafter, she rarely went back to the cafe. She sent her law clerks to get her lunch, and it's just a heartbreaking kind of reality for her. Now, at the same time, she mentored, she essentially desegregated the federal courthouse in terms of law clerks. She mentored many important figures in the law, including women judges who joined her on the bench later on. She was a friend to Sonia Sotomayor, who started out on the Southern District of New York trial court, and many others. And so, yes, it was an honor. She did a lot of amazing things for litigants and for individuals. And yet we should not fail to understand that it is burdensome to break down those doors of opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I want to, some of our audience members have been sharing questions, and there's one that I think you will enjoy answering, which is about class. So this person writes, Ellen, clearly Motley saw herself as upper middle class, as well as not a Southern Negro, and was a factor in her confidence in dealing with others, white or Black. And probably it caused some of her Black colleagues distress, as well as being a factor in her confidence and success. Can you speak to how class informed Motley's person?
Well, of course, she started off as a person from the working class. Her family was working class. And although, as I mentioned, her father dressed it up, she was working class. They were working class. They were not, in fact, the same as the white men whom her father was serving when he worked as a chef, for example, for Skull and Bones. And she had a great class consciousness. So she wrote that it was class, it was being without the deprivation economically that was most critically important to her years growing up, not race. Now, that's a bit of it's apparent, but it all depends on what one's baseline is, right? So if one is comparing oneself to Mississippi or Alabama, then it might be accurate to characterize the experience of growing up in New Haven in the 1930s and 40s as relatively racially progressive. And yet we know, and scholarship increasingly shows, that there was racial discrimination all over this country. And certainly that was a factor, as one can see, given the positions to which her family members were limited. And yet, as I said, she was taught to see herself as different. But I make the point that it's either in spite of or because of that sense of superiority that her parents inculcated, that she ends up being a civil rights lawyer, and of course fighting on behalf of Southern African Americans. And I would say that ultimately she does join the professional class. She enjoys it as anyone would, and yet she always had an empathy for people who started in modest circumstances. And as I said, she tried to mentor and did mentor students who started that way. And it was just an abiding commitment of her life, and something that I just find so admirable about her. She didn't have to be that way, but she wanted to make sure that although she was first, she would not be last.
Mhm. Yeah, and I wanted to ask you too about so she was so widely covered in the press, and she was in a position, it seemed to me from reading your book, that she had to take a lot of care with how she came across, and that was very important to her. Can you talk a little bit about why that was and what she was doing?
Sure. Well, she was always dressed to the nines. And I tell the story about how she had a personal shopper at Lord and Taylor, the New York City department store, and known for these tailored looks for professional women and feminine looks. She was very feminine. She was what they would call a handsome woman, nearly 6 feet tall. And the way that she looked certainly, I think, gave her entree into the world that she entered. She was a good-looking, feminine, presenting woman who was well dressed, and that was very important, particularly important for an African American woman, I think. And the question is whether she did that only because she needed to do it to be presentable, or whether she liked it. And I think it's a little bit of both. I think she liked fashion, and that's a good thing. She liked being, made to look presentable, and yet, of course, it's an enduring question for women about how to present, and making sure that one looks just so if one wants to have a chance to excel and be promoted in professions such as law that certainly continue to be pretty staid professions where women are underrepresented at the highest echelons.
Mhm. Yeah, and I can attest that when we were, when we were assembling the book and you shared all these amazing photos, there was just I mean, she just looks absolutely fabulous, whether she's taking a photo for a magazine or it's just a photo of her on the street. You can tell the care that she puts into her appearance.
That's right, Maria. And I just want to add that it was particularly important for her to look to be well groomed and to look good when she was in New York City politics. Part of the job of being Manhattan Borough president just involved a lot of appearances. And as you say, she just always looked great. And there are tons of pictures that are depicting her as such. And sometimes her husband is there wearing his tuxedo. And it is just, it's wonderful to see. Never wore pantsuits in person, although when she went to her summer home in Chester, Connecticut, she certainly did put on her, her Timberlands and her jeans, and she worked in her garden, and those are great to see as well.
Yep. Yep. So that leads me to another question from an audience member. How do you think she helped to define women leadership generally, especially at a time when males dominated leadership positions? Do you think this still has impact today?
Well, she was a symbol of change and the substance of change. But a point that I make in the book, or seek to make in the book, Maria, is that the beauty of it is that there are many styles of women leaders. And she was a part of a network that included Shirley Chisholm, Pauli Murray, Bella Abzug, and lots of people who together wanted to and did strive for equality and women's liberation, but they did it in different ways. So Motley was more of a moderate, and she looked like she did, like I've just described, very feminine. No one would say that about Pauli Murray. No one would say that about Ella Baker or Bella Abzug, although she had the hats, which made her stand out. But there's a beauty, and I want people to appreciate in a context where often there's a demand to be a feminist in a certain way, that at least during that era, there was more room. I think that changed over time, but there was more room because there were relatively few of these women leaders, and they moved through the world in their own way, and yet we're part of a small network of change makers.
Yeah. And here's a question about her time as a judge. Michael asks, Hayward Burns was Motley's first clerk. He became a civil rights lawyer. Can you comment on their relationship and her influence on him?
So I know Hayward Burns. He's not someone of the many clerks I interviewed that I would have interviewed. I can't imagine that. And so I can't give you any details about their relationship, but knowing what I know about her and what I know about him, it strikes me that they were a great match. And of course, many of the clerks who came to her wanted to work for her because she was so legendary. They wanted to be like her. And sort of they counted on her to show them the way. At the same time, they were very aware of the high stakes of her appointment. And so, she was a workaholic, and they had to be workaholics alongside her to make sure that she got things just right. And he was a part of that, in that number among the clerks who talked so lovingly about how important the work was for her, but also for the country.
Now we have some personal questions for you, Tomiko.
Oh.
Here's the first. Did publishing books as Dean of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute have any special meaning for you?
Well, certainly this book does. I worked on this book as a Radcliffe Fellow, and I was appointed as Dean of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, which in part has a mission of ensuring that the study of gender and women is a part of the focus of scholarship, continues to be a focus of scholarship. It's also an institution that's committed to interdisciplinary learning. I'm a lawyer and an historian, and it all just works out so well. It fits. And I say to people that this is a very Radcliffe book. I send it out into the world, and I'm so proud to have published it, and to have published it as Radcliffe Dean. The two seem to work very well together.
That's great. And about writing biography, someone is asking, what did you learn about the challenges and pleasant surprises about writing a biography?
Challenges, the challenge of writing biography, certainly of someone as important as Motley, yet not as well known by the broad public as she should be, but very well known by some in the legal profession, her clerks, her family. She has a lot of fans. I really wanted to get it just right. And that was challenging because she was a reserved person. She was closed. She wore a mask, as I indicate in the book. And moreover, judges famously do not like to leave behind much of anything that would reveal their interior lives and their thought processes. So I had to work really hard finding every single scrap of paper that I could to draw her out. And Maria helped me with this so much, just pushing me to try to bring the personal to her professional life. And I was pleased when I determined what her personality was like. And then I checked my sense of her against those who knew her well. And many of those people seemed to be very pleased with what I was able to create. And so that's very rewarding. And also, I found her an inspiring figure. I liked her, and that doesn't always happen when authors write biographies, and so I'm happy it turned out that way.
Yeah, because you spend so much time with your subject when you undertake a work like this. I mean, it was years for you, Tomiko, even before we started working together.
That's true, and that's sort of an odd thing,
Mhm.
just not being able to get someone's experience out of your head, and in fact, it requires you to keep going with them, keep thinking about them, their family. I earned my law degree from Yale, and so I knew New Haven. But when I started writing this book, I went back there to try to, I saw her childhood home and to really try to appreciate New Haven from her perspective. I visited Nevis, which is just a beautiful island in the West Indies, and was able to appreciate how her personality reflected the culture of Nevis. And so it was just a really amazing ride. And it was a labor of love, and I'm so happy to have this book out in the world.
Yeah, me too. So I want to ask you also about your time writing this, because I know that one of the challenges of writing about someone whose life was so full and of such import to us is that you have to make some difficult decisions, because you can't include everything about a person in a book. You have to.
Right.
So I wanted to ask you if there was any story or any piece that that you didn't leave in the, you didn't include in the book, but you was still kind of special to you. And is there a story that you want to tell that perhaps didn't make it in?
Well, I would say one of the things that I thought of doing, but ended up not doing, was exploring some of her cases around business issues.
Mm.
And it might have been important to do so, because a point that I make is that her career in civil rights defined her, and it defined her even when she went onto the bench. And this turned out to not have been always so good for her career. And so I wanted to write a chapter that was just about the business cases. I ended up not doing that, instead talking about some of them in the epilogue, because it turns out the most important cases really are, and the most captivating cases really do relate to the human dramas behind, the story of social change in America, and not so much to the Fortune 500 companies. So I did not include that chapter, but it's important to know that she did excel. She could handle those cases just as well as any.
That's interesting. And so for our last question, someone asked something that I'd love to hear your answer to also, which is that, have you another book in your future that you can speak about?
I am thinking about it. It's really important for me to always have a scholarly project on the horizon. I've spent a lot of time writing about the relationship between law and social change. I'm teaching a freshman seminar now about that subject. I've really written about it in various iterations for 15 years now. And I'm thinking of a shorter book, please God, a shorter book that would use the case study method to draw out some themes. I don't know that I'll end up doing that. But it is something I am thinking about. If you have any subjects that you would commend to me, let me know.
Sounds great. Well, thank you, Tomiko. Thank you to everyone. Thank you, Harvard Bookstore. Please buy this book. As Tomiko said, it is not just about a courageous and inspiring and great woman from our past, but it is a book about social change in this country. And that's such an important subject today, as it always has been. So thank you.
Thank you, Maria.
Maria, thank you for doing a great exit for your time. Tomiko, thank you very much. It was enlightening, and I'm going to head over to Harvard Bookstore this afternoon and pick up a copy. Thank you very much, ladies. Next week, February 10th, we have Patricia Sullivan, University of South Carolina history professor, who will deliver a nuanced and deeply researched portrait of Robert Kennedy's engagement with the civil rights movement as Attorney General, U.S. Senator, and presidential candidate. The topic of his talk is Robert Kennedy and the Racial Reckoning of the 1960s. Perfect timing for the month of February. Thank you all. Enjoy the week. Stay warm. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you.